For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and socially. In the midst of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other than human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationship to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding Podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media with your friends, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding or want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. When some human societies made the shift from wild procured foods to domesticated produced foods, there's a corresponding decline in the health of those people in the archaeological record. Today, the majority of people eat domesticated staples, and our health has taken a huge decline on a global scale. Wild foods are an important nutritional component to the human diet. Rewilding can mean rekindling the relationship to wild foods that humans have historically had. To talk with me about this on the Rewilding Podcast is Monica Wilde. Monica Wilde, known as Mo, is an ethnobotanist and research herbalist. She lives in Scotland in a self-built wooden house where she's created a wild teaching garden on 4 organic acres, encouraging edible and medicinal species to make their home. Mo holds a master's degree in herbal medicine, is a fellow of the Linnean Society, a member of the British Mycological Society, and a member of the Association of Foragers, which she helped found in 2015. She's been teaching foraging and herbal medicine for several decades. Mo wrote the award-winning book, The Wilderness Cure: Ancient Wisdom in a Modern World in 2022, that imparts what she learned from her year of living on only wild foods. Afterwards, she started the Wildbiome Project, a citizen science study tracking the health changes seen on wild food diets. The next arm of the study is in 2025. Mo, thank you for coming on the Rewilding Podcast.
Hi, Peter. You're very welcome.
So just to kind of get started, how did you get into wild foods?
Gosh, well, I've always had an interest in wild foods. You know, I grew up outdoors as a kid. I grew up in Kenya. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, I was the eldest of 5 children. We were all born quite close together. So basically, as long as you turned up for meal times and bedtime, nobody really knew where you were or what you were up to, as long as you were out. So there was a lot of freedom. And I was really drawn to being outside. I was really drawn to being, spending time learning about stuff from the people that I grew up around, who were mainly the Kikuyu tribe. And I think also when I was little, I was a really big reader. And the sort of classic English literature, Jane Austen and things like that, just didn't make any sense to me with the sort of life I had growing up.
Mm.
So I was much more attracted to like Women of the Oregon Trail or Annie Get Your Gun. and then through that, discovered the American Indian, the First Nation traditions, which were so like the African traditions as well. So I was reading a lot about bushcraft and wild food, even at sort of 7, 8 years old. And it wasn't until, my children. So I came back to the UK in the 1990, bringing up 3 kids on my own, and was finding it very hard to make ends meet. And one day, a friend of mine who was doing an art project, with children for the Forestry Commission, said to me, they want something to do with the adults. You know about plants. Do you fancy doing something? And I just said yes to virtually any way of earning money.
Sure, yeah.
Well, almost any way of earning money at the time. And so that was when I ran my first foraging courses. And it was popular. It was repeated. I was mainly working with ethnic groups in the UK to teach them more about access to the spaces that, you know, people living here took for granted. And then I suppose at the same time that other people started to become really interested and say, oh, what you're doing, that sounds really interesting. Can we do it? It was also when social media and the internet were starting to take off as well. And I started to run public courses and then put them online. And it's kind of just snowballed since then. And I think once I realized that people were going to come back more than once, I realized I'd also have to up my game a bit as well.
Right. Yeah.
Couldn't only teach them about nettles.
So yeah, that's another good question, is like, yeah, how do you see the difference between your first classes and what you do now?
I think at the beginning, I spent more time explaining the botany, trying to make sure that they'd be able to identify that specific plant. Nowadays, I actually really view it quite differently. I'm not really teaching them about botany. What I'm doing is telling the stories of the plants we live amongst, so that people understand what an awesome world it is that we live in, and how amazing these other than human species are, and the innate intelligence of nature. So, nobody who comes on one foraging walk is going to suddenly learn everything they need to know. It is a process of learning. But if I can light a fire in somebody so that they leave that going, oh, wow, I need to learn. And they just, they'll go into 100 books, and they'll go on courses with lots of different people, and they will just have this avid desire to learn. If I can light that fire, that's what I'm more interested in.
Yeah, awesome. So one of the questions that I think about a lot when it comes to wild food is, how do we define wild in like, there's some gray areas, obviously there's genetic markers for what we call domesticated plants, but I also think about things like feral fruit, like apples, for example. Like a lot of the apples that people eat today aren't exactly, it's not like they were genetically modified in a laboratory, but they're way more full of sugars and things like that than they had been originally, and so they're sort of domesticated in a kind of way. But if you find one in a feral apple orchard, for instance, is that wild? So I'm curious, like, what your take on the definition of wild food is versus domesticated or feral foods.
Well, first of all, I think the question's interesting because you're looking for a definition. And I don't really do definitions. I'm kind of really allergic to labels. And I view wild food, or, the food that we have from plants, on a continuum, much more in the way that I look at neurodiversity or, any other, or the continuum of health, for instance, which has, healthy life at one end, death at the other, and we're all somewhere in between. And when you look at it that way, if you look at the continuum of what is wild and what is, what's at the other end, probably ultra processed foods, UPFs, we're all sort of somewhere on the middle of that. You're going from, if you look at pure wild, really, really wild, very often there'd be nothing to eat because plants like to grow in colonies. And will very often, form dense packs of things and then keep out other varieties and species. But once humans start to disturb the land, that's where so many of the weeds thrive, on the borders, on the edges. They're edgy. Are they truly wild if they're growing somewhere where, humans have come along and, prepared the earth not by tilling, but by just plowing a ditch through something, or so it's not so easy to say yes, this is wild and has no human influence. I presume what most people mean is wild means no human influence, but there's very little of that.
Totally.
So really it's the sort of continuum of wild, feral, which is probably originally cultivated and then gone back to the wild, or escaped into the wild. So it's there originally because it had some human help to get there. So like Japanese knotweed, for instance, somebody imported it from somewhere during the Victorian times because they thought it made a dramatic clump of bamboo-like foliage, and then it escaped.
Yeah.
Is it a domesticated plant or is it feral? Well, it's not fully wild here. It's not native, but it's pretty feral. And then you've got, cultivated, which in some ways, again, that's still a continuum. When if you do, as the First Nations people used to do a controlled burn occasionally, that encourages species to come back. Sometimes harvesting things in a certain way encourages them to be more prolific. Most of the people that I know who collect wild foods on a commercial basis, will go back and spread seed, just, fling seed, do a bit of guerrilla gardening. Yes, it's still a form of cultivation. But then that quickly moves in from shepherding the plant community to agriculture. And agriculture in its own way has this continuum between, the care and attention of an organic gardener through to, vast sections of the Midwest that have been completely cleared of any habitation whatsoever as cornfields march across, like the new pioneer settlers, removing all humans in their wake. And then finally, of course, they're processed into these UPFs, these modern foods as well. So that doesn't really answer your need for a definition, but that says more about you than about.
Well, no, this is exact. I agree with you. I feel like there's this deep spectrum, and I feel like this is an important thing for people to consider when they're thinking about wild. Even just the label wild conjures up certain things, and it's like you were saying, most people think of wild as untouched by humans. I think there was a book that I read in the early 2000s called Tending the Wild by M. Cat Anderson that was about Native American land management in California that was like non-agricultural and sort of doing exactly what you're saying, which is sort of like re-looking at this concept of wild and wildness in particular and sort of seeing it on the spectrum. So I deeply appreciate your perspective. And I think it's just an important thing, to break down that concept of wild.
Exactly. And it's the more you think about it, the more you realize that there is a huge variety and richness of relationships that we have with plants in many different ways. And it's good to be asked those questions that sort of challenge us.
Yeah.
I think nowadays there's generally a trend to look more at trying to define things and label things as we move from, 100 years ago, people would go out and explore the untouched wilderness of the earth and make a map and label the places and label the mountains and so on. Nowadays, it seems to be that people are turning inward and exploring that, wilderness within and looking at, labels and definitions of the inner landscape. But we can sometimes forget that if we try to put things in too many little, boxes, that we then lose that overall appreciation of this of the massive diversity that is life on planet Earth.
Totally. Yeah. So, we can all just go and buy food from the grocery store. It's not like we need to go out and cultivate really or forage for our own wild food. It's almost sometimes more expensive to do like gardening or even foraging if you have to like drive out of town and that kind of thing. So what is important about wild food that we might want to do it even though it's not necessarily, a requirement anymore? Like, what is the value of wild food?
There's value in so many different ways with wild food. I think, first of all, what you have to remember is that 50% of the daily calorie intake globally comes from just a few species: wheat, corn, and rice. Those are winter crops that provide starch for energy. They're carbohydrate energy. And once you actually increase that out, 80% of the daily calorie intake of the world comes from, I think, just 8 species. So you've got wheat, corn, and rice, and then you've got things like, potatoes, soya, and so forth. And what wild plants, what foraging gives you is the diversity that brings in everything else other than the carbohydrate, other than that calorific energy. When you look at studies of plants, we tend to think of food in terms of the macronutrients and then a couple of micronutrients, vitamins A, B, C, D, E, and calcium, iron, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, a couple of things. But when you start to analyze a plant, you realize that it has hundreds of flavonoids and terpenoids and terpenes and other chemicals and things going on. And we haven't even started to quantify how good that is for humans. We know that things like a high intake of flavonoids help to protect your eye health, help to keep down inflammation. As people are moving into nutraceuticals.
Wow, I haven't heard that one yet.
Well, we're taking supplements. We're taking nutraceutical supplements to compensate for the lack of wild food in our diet. And, that's happening in the West, in the non-West part of the world. So, I mean, like in African countries and large parts of Asia, a lot of people still eat wild food regularly. Some 50% of the world's global population still relies on wild food, for, some of its, some of its food or some of its living. And that goes up to, 70% in some of the poorer areas. In places that are hit by war, like, Syria was, with earthquakes and then, a civil war, some 84% of people were adding wild foods into their diet. So, if a plant has, even if you said a plant has 10 unique phytonutrients that are just specific to that plant, I know it's a lot more, it's like 100, but let's take it easy for the maths. And during my wild food year, I ate 300 species of wild plants. Times 10, that's 3,000 different micronutrients that I wasn't getting from the supermarket. You said that when people moved from foraging to farming, there was also a decline in health. There was more inflammation. There was arthritis. There was, now we're living in a world that's full of diabetes and cancer. When I was a child, you didn't hear much about cancer. By the time I got to my teens, you were hearing statistics like, 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 people might get cancer. By the time I was in my 30s, it was 1 in 5 people might get cancer. By the time I was in my 40s, it was 1 in 3. And now it's like every other person is likely to get a cancer. And it's not really that it's better diagnosis or that we're living longer. Yes, there are improvements in diagnosis, but it's the way that we live is more stress producing and inflammation producing. And that's both the foods that we eat, but it's also the stress that's involved in the modern lifestyle. And very often it's stress that we don't even think about because, it's like normal life.
Right.
Your kids come down for breakfast in the morning, they're sitting in front of somebody's put the telly on, there's the news, the morning news on the telly, kids eating its cereal, there are bombs going off, there's reports of children being, killed in other parts of the world and shooters and all the rest of it. And you walk to school and a couple of police cars might go by with their sirens. These all engender stress inside the human body. We're still the Stone Age people with the same old limbic system that we've always had. So what wild plants do is they give you the opportunity to rebalance your system, to provide real depth nutrition. I never feel as good off wild food as I do when I'm on it. There's a mental clarity, a focus. There's a deep sense of real nourishment on wild food. Other reasons, cultural. Sometimes it's the way that you prepare a food together, or a lot of Polish people who came over here, would tell me, oh yes, I used to go with my grandparents to the woods and we'd forage for mushrooms. My grandmother would show me how to prepare this. There's a dish that unites the family or the culture. For poverty, to make ends meet. I think, I must have saved not buying food for a year. I don't buy, I never bought lots and lots of expensive stuff anyway, but I must have saved thousands of pounds and never had to put the garbage out. Generated no trash whatsoever. Yeah, there are many reasons.
Awesome.
Many reasons to eat wild food.
Yeah. So then tell me about the wild biome. Well, before we do that, I just want to talk about, before I jump into the wild biome, I want to ask you, what were the challenges of eating wild for a year?
So the challenges of eating wild for the year, I think the first one was that you have to plan in advance and prepare in advance. And it's not just because of the seasons, because obviously, at the moment, everybody who's participating next year is outside beavering, squirreling away, gathering nuts and berries and, putting them aside so they've got that to fall back on next year. But it's also that it's quite challenging to do it around, modern work. Because if you have a couple of days when you're tied to your desk or, just caught up in the busyness of the life that we've created to earn money instead of, being self-sufficient, you can't be caught on the hop because there's nothing to snack. You can't just go and buy snacks or buy food. So there was a couple of times where I'd have to make long journeys, for instance, or I'd be away from home for a couple of days. And, you can't just stop at a gas station and buy a packet of crisps to keep you going. You've got to be prepared with some pemmican or some jerky, or, if I had a clinic day, I'd need to make sure that I had, some foragers' pot noodles, some sea spaghetti that I'd frozen in packets of 100 grams, which is about 4 ounces. And then I could just pop them into hot water. They're ready in about 3 minutes. I can add a bit of rosehip puree, rosehip passata on top. And that's a sort of fairly quick meal. But if you're not prepared, if you don't spend time prepping at the weekends, you can get cut short and be quite hungry.
Mm-hmm. So without eating those main, cultivated grain staples, what was the majority of your caloric intake?
Yeah, quite challenging actually. There was a couple of days where I wrote down to the best of my knowledge what the calorific intake was, and I'd be hard pushed to eat more than 1,000 calories a day. Now, that wasn't partly because I couldn't. I could have eaten more, but it was also because I didn't want to eat more, because I was satiated and satisfied on that amount. And that would have included some venison, lots of greens, some burdock or dandelion root, some berries, maybe some nuts. But obviously, when you're doing it for a year, you don't have nuts all year round. You get through them in the winter fairly quickly.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But our bodies are highly adaptive. That's why it's so possible for us to be, omnivorous and to thrive on lots of different types of diets. And you look at that with the people there's lots of people espousing particular diets. The paleo diet's really good for you. The vegan diet's really good for you. The pescatarian diet's good for you. The Mediterranean diet's good for you. And to a certain extent, our bodies adapt and, can live on different things. But the one thing that you learn when you do this for a year is that, nature forces you to move in and out of different states. And some people's body types, respond better at different times of the year to different things. I'm somebody who, yeah, I'm fine doing carbs during the winter, but the rest of the year, if I eat carbs, I just put a lot of weight on very, very quickly. I can eat the same thing as everyone else in the house. I'll put up weight on, nobody else will. Nothing's changed except the fact I have this body and then they have other bodies.
Mm-hmm.
But, so what I found was that my body really loves it to come out of the winter being fueled on carbohydrates, to go into this sort of detoxification and then cleansing sort of keto period. And then by the summer, it's needing a lot of fats again. So during the early spring, you'll take off that winter weight. So your body's doing keto on your own body weight. During the summer, of course, you need fats again. You're driven back to the ocean in quest of mackerel and other fatty fish. And then, there's this sort of beautiful cycle. And you don't realize that to begin with. I was saying to somebody the other day that for all that we can theorize about what it might have been like to be a hunter-gatherer or eat this certain way, until you actually do it, you don't really know. That doing of it so important. And I've spent time with hunter-gatherers in the Southern Hemisphere, in Namibia. And what's so interesting there, and because a lot of the paleo research is based on that sort of African archaeology, what it was like when we were in Africa, but the whole plant world is turned upside down there. So it's a very different way of eating. They when you look at the plants here in Scotland, there's lots of lush leafy greens in the spring and very little root, because roots are there to hold water and starches, and they don't need to do that in Scotland because we have more rain than you ever dream of. So the roots tend to be like little gnarled, wiry things, holding on to the rocks and the soil for dear life so they don't get washed out and swept away. Whereas in the Kalahari, you'll see these tiny little tendrils of green, barely a few inches above the surface. And you'll dig down a foot and there'll be a tuber the size of a baby that's amazing, full of water and starches, trying to survive in that. So, you can't really compare. And when I started to look at, Western foraging and what there was in the academic record, there are studies of ethnobotanical record. This is what people, still eat, or this is what people have eaten in the last century. But apart from carbon dating of bones, carbon isotoping of bones, there wasn't really anything which would show how our bodies would fare and survive on wild foods. And even with carbon isotoping, nobody then kept a diet diary. And this is what's really interesting about the Wildbiome Project, actually, is that we've partnered with the University of Bradford, their School of Archaeological and Forensic Science, Julia, known as the Tooth Fairy. And they have been, studying bones from the medieval times going backwards to the Stone Age, and looking at, what people were eating, what people ate during times of famine. But nobody then kept a diet diary.
Right.
So we're cutting off our hair, not shaving our heads, but cutting off locks of hair and our fingernails and sending it into them during the project, because now they've actually got a sort of control study.
So let's talk about this is a good segue to the next portion, which is what is the Wildbiome Project?
Yes. So, well, to segue back, after when I did the year of living on wild food, it had really come out of the challenge of people asking me on foraging walks. This is all very well telling us that cleaver seeds can be used at coffee, but really, could you actually live on this stuff for a year?
Yeah.
And at the end of the year, I did it with my friend Matt as well. We had 2 sets of gut microbiome tests, which we'd done at each, when the food source changed. And I tried to get scientists interested in helping me to work out what some of these changes meant, because there were some very large changes. And, I wasn't asking anyone to do it for free. I was happy to pay for it. But everybody was really cagey about getting involved. There's no control group. There's, you could just be two weird people. A study of one or two.
Right.
Make
Yeah.
it. And I realized that if we were actually ever going to learn anything or for it to be taken seriously, it would have to be approached as a proper study.
Totally.
And when I did my master's degree in herbal medicine, I learned how to design clinical trials and proper studies. So even though I didn't get around to doing it till I was 50, it's not wasted. So basically, I designed this study and approached other people that I knew through the Association of Foragers. So this was an organization that was set up in 2015 to provide community for people teaching and working in this area. And so I knew that these people would have, knowledge of wild foods. So, it'd be fairly safe for them to do it. And I'd approached various different people for doing it. And then through a chance introduction with Dan Saladino at BBC Radio 4, who's been very interested in following the project, he introduced me to Professor Tim Spector, who said that Zoe would basically help by providing the gut microbiome tests and the blood sugar control and measuring us against their control group that they were using as well. So what it meant was that we could take this group of 24 people, we divided it in half, so 12 did it for 3 months, which I felt was long enough to start to see I knew was long enough to start to see some interesting changes. But also we asked 12 of them to just do it for 1 month, because if you can see those changes happen over 3 months, well, how much of those changes would you see over 1 month, given that a lot of people would find it very difficult to do this for a period of time? So we measured, at the start and end of the project, we did gut microbiome tests. We did some health blood checks. So we were looking at cholesterol, at blood sugar, at inflammation markers, at key, vitamins and minerals, vitamin B12, magnesium, iron, those sorts of things. We took everyone's measurements. Everyone had to get on the scales and get the tape measures out. And we wore blood sugar monitors. And the results really speak for themselves. In those people who were obese or overweight, over 3 months, the average weight loss was 16% of their body weight.
Wow.
But on those who, those people who didn't need to lose weight, didn't lose much. They lost a few kilos, but not masses. With blood sugar, someone with diabetes returned to normal blood status. There was only one person with diabetes, but, other people, when you looked at their blood sugar, where it had been at the high end, but still of the normal range, it had gone back towards, the middle of the normal range. Cholesterol was a little bit different in that 3/5, so 60% of people who had high cholesterol at the start found improvements in their cholesterol. 40% didn't, though, so we're not really sure why that happened. And 1 or 2 people, it went up a little bit. I think there may be a link with familial hypercholestemia. But so so that was interesting, but it was still quite a small study. So we're doing it again.
Yeah, that's exciting.
We've now got 90 people signed up.
Wow.
We've had over 190, getting on towards 200 applicants.
Amazing.
To take part, and not just from the UK, which surprised me. We've got a European cohort. We've got a few people in the States who want to do it alongside this. And we've got 90 people signed up. So that means that, when people apply, they then need to be given information so that they can really fully understand it. They need to sign, consent so that information can be shared, meetings can be recorded and shared. They're all taking part in a portal. So I have to have a formal sort of process about it. and then they ask to sign informed consent. So you have to take them through what are the risks, and so it's all done, in a very ethical way.
Yeah.
But now they're on board. We have a online sort of community portal where everybody can support each other, arrange to go out. One of the wonderful things that's come out of it is the sort of community or communal aspect. So people are arranging trips where they're getting together with other people and going foresting together,
so
and
awesome
stuff together. And then in the last 2 years, I've spent a lot of time with my daughter, who's helping me at the moment. We've been building a wild food tracker app. So over the last 20 years, because I'm also, as a herbalist, really interested in nutrition and food, the seat of health is the gut. I've been collecting nutritional data from loads and loads of journals and different places and things, because there isn't a single database where they all exist. Or there wasn't until now.
Yeah.
Now there is.
Yeah.
And I've put it into a tracker app so people can enter what they're eating without having to type out each ingredient, because that was a big thing that put people off last time, tracking, doing the food diaries and that. But now they'll be able to track really easily what they're eating, and I will be able to track the nutritional value of each meal that they eat.
Amazing.
So it's all very, very exciting. And
so how many people? So you've got 90 people.
90 people.
Are you looking for more? Is there a cap? Is there a, because I feel like there's probably tens of thousands of people who would want to be involved in this if they knew it was happening and knew how to access it. You know what I mean? So I'm sure, you did your preliminary one. This is the second one. It's just going to gain, in my perspective, it's probably just going to gain more and more traction. So is this one, what's your cap on the number of people? And then three questions together. What's your cap on the number of people for the second study? How long is it? You had some people do a month and some people do 3 months in the first one. Are you going to do longer or shorter? And then the third question relates back to my first question, sort of in terms of defining wild versus domestic. Are there foods that are off limits that you're and how do you determine in the study what constitutes the wildness of the food that you're consuming?
Yeah. Okay. Well, you just want a definition, don't you?
Well, what are the limitations? I don't want the definition. I'm just because you do have to, cut things out specifically to do the survey, right? So you have to find a place on that spectrum that you're kind of or some zone in the spectrum where you're okay, don't eat pizza from Pizza Hut or something along those lines, right?
So for the easy question first is this study is running from the 1st of April till the 30th of June. Cool. And those people who are doing 3 months have to do from the 1st of April to the 30th of June. And people doing 1 month can choose either April or May or June. The plan is, at the moment, with the University of Bradford, we're applying for a 5-year rolling project fund. And we are looking at running another cohort in the autumn of 2026. Because what that will do is, at the moment, we're doing spring into summer. But what that will do will give us a autumn into winter profile as well. So that's the sort of immediate part. So anybody not taking part this year can go and brush up their skills and possibly take part next year. And because the university is studying quite specifically things in this country, Northwest Europe, at the moment, really, the funding is limited to here and Northwest Europe. But even so, because of the way that academic funding happens, which is all according to sort of time schedules and things. So if they've got questions, you have to, the clock stops and you go back and there's another date where it restarts again. We're not sure if all the funding will be in place before the start of the project. And what I've asked people to do is to crowdfund for their own tests. This is really the only limiting factor on the scale of it, and that's how do we pay for this? Because I'm just one person. I mean, to date, I've never got paid a penny for any of the organizing, the admin, research, the report writing, the looking after people, nothing.
Totally.
But I love the science of it. I'm doing this out of passion.
Yeah.
If people are happy to pay for their own tests, that obviously makes it so much easier, because it costs about $680, we'll call it £700, which is probably about $800 if the tests are about the same price, to do the tests at the beginning and at the end if you're doing the full range of tests. And of course you could do it by just doing like only the gut microbiome part of it, test part or whatever. What would be really great, I mean, we've got a small group of people who've applied to do it from the States who are going to do it. And what would be really good would be to see if there's an appetite for a large cohort in the States. And that would be, measured against an American control group, and could probably be better funded in America because you've got access to far more diverse and wealthy people in America. Somebody might be really interested in sponsoring that. But what I've created is this sort of mechanism that makes it easy for the participants to do it in pretty much any country. Obviously, with the food tracker that tracks everything for the project, we'd have to add a lot more ingredients if the more countries that get added. So at the moment, the cap on it is how much funding can we raise. But if people are self-funding, then that's not an obstacle.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And definitions. So within our community portal, so once people have gone through the process and have signed up their informed consent and they join the community portal, within that I have a sort of project manual, and part 3 sets out the sort of stipulation for wild. So really it's wild and feral. We've had to make some concessions for fallback foods for people who live in cities so that they can join as well. I know it's different in the States, but in the UK, most of us do not bear arms. And certainly if you're living in the middle of a city, you've got no reason to have a shotgun license or a rifle. So there have had to be some exceptions to allow people to purchase, say, for instance, fish from a local fishmonger. It must be locally caught in British waters in season. And the same with, venison. And I would say things like, if you have to use the fallback to buy venison, don't go out and just buy venison steak, because you would have eaten and used the whole animal.
Totally.
So buy a deer carcass and use all of it. Mince it up, use the sinews, use the pluck, use the heart. Apart from anything else, that's the way that you do honor a life when you take a life. So, and then in terms of, people are not allowed to eat, vegetables they've grown in their garden, no matter how, even if they are an heirloom variety, they're still going to have more sugars and this and that and the other.
Totally.
But, if somebody's thrown an apple core out of a window and years later it's grown into a wild apple tree, then that does count as sort of feral. Japanese knotweed shoots, they would count. To a certain extent, some trees in city parks, cornelian cherry, and a lot of people have hedges made of Oregon grape.
Oh, really? That's funny.
Yeah, awesome. Particularly the one with the miniature leaves, and you suddenly find a wall of berries in a city. And sometimes there might be. I mean, fuchsia over here some people grow it as a plant, but it also has escaped into the wild as well.
Mm-hmm.
And fuchsia berries are, they're like a cross between a fig and a grape.
Hmm.
But on the whole, I've asked people to eat as wild as possible. But people do say to me, like, oh, what's allowed and what isn't allowed? And what I've had to say is, you're all adults. You came on the project because you're really interested in eating wild food. So if you start taking shortcuts, it's not going to help the project.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately it'll be reflected in your hair and your stools. So the microbiome tests will be different. So I think because, foragers in general tend to be a little bit anarchic.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't very good at sitting still behind a desk.
Yeah.
There's a lot of neurodiversity in the foraging world. And of course, as soon as you start to put up what looks like a set of rules, people want to push it and see if they can break them.
Yep.
And it's like, hey, don't you view this as a set of rules and try and break it. You're an adult, you've got the foraging experience. You want to do this project because you want to see what wild is. So do it.
I did I don't know if you're familiar with Lynx Vilden. She's
Yes.
does the Stone Age immersion projects. Yeah, I did her project in 2012, and she wanted us to only bring wild food on the backpacking expedition part of it. And we asked her, this same question, right? Like, what do you mean wild food? Because we've got there was a domesticated llama that a farmer wanted to give us. And, she was like, no, that doesn't count. You can't bring that. And, but it was weird because we were buying, salmon and fish that had been wild caught, but had been shipped, 500, 600 miles inland from the coast that we were processing to bring with us versus eating this llama that was born and raised and grown like right there. So there was an interesting thing of local versus wild in that conversation, which is totally side tangent. But the distinction this is why I wanted to say the distinction that she made to us was she wanted something, and I'm gonna imitate her, but she wanted us to only be eating things that had disdain for humans, which was her sort of concept of wildness was I love Lynx. I love her program and stuff, but I thought that was one of the funniest things was she really wanted in terms of the meat that we were consuming, something that wasn't, in deep relation or mutualistic relationship with humans, something that was, wild in the sense of wanting to escape the clutches of humans, not something that was born and raised and grown around them, which I thought was an interesting take. And so we did, we got wild foods in that regard, and had to dehydrate them and stuff because this was all food that we were taking with us up into the mountains in that project. Anyway, I just like the different sort of perspectives around.
Well, I think also it's because the University of Bradford are looking at looking at it from the perspective of archaeological forensic science. Was this available as a food in the Stone Age?
Totally. Yeah.
And the further away it is from being food available in the Stone Age, the less you ought to eat it.
Yeah.
And certainly in the UK, llamas are very far from the Stone Age.
Yeah. Same here, I suppose.
Yeah. Where there's wild, there's an island in Scotland where there's some wild sheep.
Yeah.
Nah.
Are there actually wild sheep over there?
Yeah, there's some wild cows as well. There's a little island where people used to live as crofters, and I don't know why they had to leave. But there's a herd of wild cows on one of the islands.
That's cool. Yeah, when I was in Ireland last month for the Wild Awake gathering, one of Lucy's friends had shot a deer the day before for the gathering, a red deer, so we got to eat red deer. We were eating like deer and potatoes for for days, and it was awesome to be able to. And we did like a pit roast of the deer leg that Lucy organized and ran, and it was probably some of the best meat I've ever had in my life. Yeah.
Well, pit roasting is a special way of cooking, I must say. I'm partial to pit roast myself, particularly clay.
Yeah, I've done it a couple of times and it hasn't turned out exactly what I was hoping, but I think Lucy had it really dialed in at this point because she's done her honoring the deer class so many times that,
Mm,
she's just got it really dialed in.
yeah. But there is a focus on eating a wide variety of plants as well. And it's interesting because, when we did Wildbiome One with the Zoe Health Project, they were advising that people try and eat 30 different species of plant a week.
Mm,
And basically, we were eating about 50
yeah,
different plant species
yeah,
a week.
that's
And that
awesome.
wasn't trying to, if I'd been trying to just tick boxes, I could have eaten a lot more.
Yeah.
But we were eating about 50.
Yeah, I'm really shocked by the math that you did earlier in terms of thinking about the number of like flavonoids and phytochemicals and all the things that,
The nutrients, yes.
yeah, that are in the diversity of those plants. Like I've never really thought about the sort of exponential math of how much we're getting out of that stuff before. I feel like I would be pretty lazy and just eat acorns or something. You know what I mean? I'm like, I did the Boss Boulder Outdoor Survival School. They have a class called the Hunter Gatherer, where you spend 2 weeks basically only foraging what you can out in the deserts of Utah. And you bring a little bit of pemmican. And when I say a little bit, I mean like less than a handful for 2 weeks, and the rest of it is just stuff that you're getting out there. And people drop weight pretty quick because in part you're starving, but you're also getting all of these other things, and eating all these different diverse foods. And it was just funny because I was thinking about the number of even just the different number of animals that we'd eaten, not eat like forget about plants, we were eating mice and rats and squirrels and fish and just things that I don't normally eat, and so it was interesting to think even just in that short window of time, getting out and eating a lot more diverse than I do day to day.
Yeah. Well, even with so Kingdom Animalia, which includes, game and game birds, but also includes fish, insects, mollusks.
Mm-hmm.
I think we ate 44 species over,
Wow.
a year.
Wow.
But that included things like wasp larvae and
Oh my God, that's awesome. That's amazing. Wow. Yeah. How did the wasp larva
87
taste?
and 87 different species of mushrooms, um,
Wow.
20 different species of seaweed, just because that's where I'm not particularly near the coast, but when I do go,
Mhm.
that's the range there. If I'd gone over to the west coast as well, I could have added another sort of 5 to 10 species on that
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. That's
But
awesome.
we would have moved around, and that's you couldn't do the Wildbiome Project nowadays, without a car.
Hmm.
I mean, you could do it over the course of a year, but you'd have to be on the move and moving.
Totally.
You asked me before about what were some of the difficulties or some of the barriers to wild food. And the biggest one is land access.
Hmm.
Yes, your own time, but land access. And I forget that because, here in Scotland, we have something called the right to roam. With that also comes certain responsibilities. But within the right to roam, we also have the right to harvest for our personal use.
Hmm.
So that doesn't mean that you can go into anybody's garden. There's something called curtilage, which means that you can't go into the direct vicinity of our house. But for people who own large ranches or large estates, some of these big and very often absent landowners, you can go. You can go across that land. You can take from that land the wild things. And I
Amazing.
know not that given in any other country.
Yeah. No, I feel like,
And it's not the same in the States.
no, there's definitely, people have their no trespassing signs. If you come on their property, they can shoot you. There's all kinds of stuff like that here. It's pretty absurd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would, that's one of the biggest obstacles for people's access to wild foods
Hmm.
now. And that so much of the land is owned by people rather
Hmm.
than shared by people.
Hmm. Yeah. So return to the commons would be helpful for.
And protect what commons we have left too.
Yeah.
I mean, very, very often there's a knee-jerk, you'll get somebody committing a sort of foraging felony, like picking commercially and dumping huge piles of mushrooms under the side of the road, or over harvesting or whatever. And then you start to hear the sort of land authorities going like, we should ban foraging, or ban mushroom picking in this forest. And it's like, do we ban cars because some people speed?
Yeah. Right.
No, we don't. What we do is we enforce it. We arrest, we stop and arrest the people who are speeding. We find them. We make them go on courses. So why ban foraging when it's only ever one or two people? Because by and large, when you educate people about wild food, when wild food becomes important to them, you have the best conservationists, the best stewards, the people who really not only really care about nature, but who really know what's going on
Totally.
The ground plant level.
Yeah.
And why disengage them just because one or two people break the law?
Right.
It's pure laziness when that happens. And that was one of the reasons that we founded the association, to be visible as a community that needed a voice to protect the commons.
Yeah. So what are your, what are some core takeaways of foraging ethics?
Love the land. Really, when, I really think of it, it's like you can say, well, what would be the ethics of having a relationship with your girlfriend or your boyfriend?
Yeah,
when
totally.
you love someone, you treat them with respect. You don't push them further than they can go. You reciprocate. You exchange gifts. You look after them. You cherish them. You nurture them. And we need ethics in nature because we've lost that love that we had, that sort of tender love of the mother, that all the indigenous peoples share. There's very interesting, I think it was I'm not sure if it was where I read it, whether it was in I can't remember where I read it. It might have been Robin Wall Kimmerer, was comparing the origination stories between the sort of Judeo-Christian sort of beliefs that from Genesis, that that God made the world and then he put man in there to be in charge as a master over everything, which was basically in the Western world we've taken to mean that we're in charge of nature and we can do what we like and we can exploit it and use everything, as opposed to some of the First Nation stories of how the earth was started, where man came about because he fell to earth in the belly of a pregnant woman who was vulnerable, and the animals came and helped, and they gave their milk and they gave their fur to keep warm, and the plants all lined up and gave a promise that they would all give a gift in our hour of need. And by God, they have, and they still do. But when you look at that cultural difference of where the very core of your religion says either I'm here to be grateful for everything that I've been given, and I'm in relationship with all of these other plants and animals and manifestations of life that all have their equal place, versus I'm here to be in charge and I can rape and pillage and exploit and mine, and it's a very different relationship. And foraging done ethically takes you back to the heart of relationship. And also it's not, I talked about with the Wildbiome Project, this beauty of community. And again, one of the reasons for starting the Association of Foragers, that community, we've lost those sort of tribal communities because we were once indigenous peoples ourselves. Here before the Romans came and screwed everything up for us.
Yeah, right.
Still waiting on the Italians to apologize. But no, in all seriousness, it's with community, you don't just go out and take for yourself. You would develop community harvesting plans and get together and do things. So that restoration of love for our neighbor and love for the land is what drives the ethics. Mm-hmm. It really does.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you. Can you tell me a little bit more about the Association of Foragers? Is this like an international thing? What is the sort of goal of it, and how do people get connected?
Yeah, well, it started on a drunken week where five of us had spent some time together and enjoyed it so much that we thought we should do it again. And at that point, going back to 2014, 2015, there wasn't a lot of community. You were starting to be aware of other people doing foraging because social media was starting to sort of take off a bit. But, most people were used to being the only weird one at home who was told to, oh, for goodness sake, can you not stop talking about plants or mushrooms? And we thought it would be really lovely to find a way to connect people. And it started on, I think Andy Hamilton set up a sort of Facebook group. We were going to call it the Intergalactic Federation of Foragers. And it called a meeting for anybody interested in a vegan cafe in Bristol. And I remember driving down there with Mark Williams from Galloway Wild Foods, a friend of mine. And we were both going, if it's going to turn into one of these hierarchical type organizations with a committee, we're out. We wouldn't want to belong to an organization that wants us. But we all had such an amazing weekend, and we had this big roundtable discussion and lots of different views. And one of the first things that we set out, at the end of it, there was a vote. And the vote was for, do we all want something? We didn't know what it was that we wanted, but we all knew we all wanted something. There was a unanimous vote for something. And what I then volunteered to work on kind of pulling things together. And we built a website with a forum, and I was on the committee for about 8 years. Initially, I think in the first year I was the committee. and thankfully I'm not now, but it's grown. I think there's about 170, 180, getting on towards 200 members, predominantly people teaching foraging, and a few people who are, commercially supplying. And it's not all just people in the UK. There's some people in the States and Canada. We've got members in Scandinavia and Western Europe and the Mediterranean and Cyprus. So it's open to anyone. But it does tend to be that most of the activity is happening in the UK because the members get together and they organise outings and things like that through the network. But, the very first thing that we did was hammer out our principles of practice, which is our sort of moral and ethical code, which is published on the Association of Foragers website, which had to, which everybody has to sign up and agree to if they're going to become a member. And then we have an annual meetup that is about 4 or 5 days, normally held in February when it's cold and we're not all busy running courses and things. And we get together and there is much feasting and talking, and we put on workshops for each other, and we get together and cook amazing meals with each other and for each other. And there's very often a lot of partying and staying up late, solving the problems of the world with the aid of a homebrewed tipple. But it was really about becoming a connected and visible community. Where, nowadays, I mean, at one stage, I think it used to be there was it felt like there were only 2 of us in Scotland sort of teaching. I mean, obviously there were more, but it was, there wasn't that visibility. Now, foraging's becoming very popular again with young people who are, rejecting the sort of postmodern urban view of an urban and capitalist view, and sort of looking back towards, well, isn't there a better balance? And there's a lot of people coming up and teaching. And one of the things I'm not very keen on would be developing courses and people having to have exams and licenses to teach, because foraging is of itself the commons, common knowledge. It's our common heritage. And, it doesn't matter whether you can teach just 10 plants really, really well and excite a passion in somebody, or you can, teach 300 and overwhelm them in the first hour. But what is important is that, if there's going to be competition amongst people teaching, that there's good quality competition. Competition in itself isn't something we should be frightened of. You can't always, spend all your energy looking over your shoulder, wondering if somebody's coming up behind you. What you have to realize is that if people are passionate and you're in a good industry, then, people will go out, not just buy one book, they'll buy loads of books. You just have to look at my bookshelves.
Yeah, totally.
People who get interested in photography don't go on just one course. They'll go on multitudes of courses. And if we're ever going to be able to preserve the commons and access to woodlands and access to meadows and access to the shore, we have to show that we are also a responsible community of people.
Totally.
So,
yeah.
But yes,
awesome.
Anyone can join if they're working in it. It's not for people who are just interested in foraging.
Sure. Yeah. Cool. This is our we're basically out of time, but I wanted to ask if there was anything else, any thoughts you had kind of coming up where you're like, oh, I should say this. Any last thoughts you want to make sure you say on the podcast before we close out?
Gosh, no. I mean, we can have round 2.
Yeah, I know. I still have questions on my list, but yeah.
It's not yeah, I mean, this is something that I'm very, very passionate about. So I could, talk for Scotland for hours on it, but there's only so much that people want to listen to.
Right, in a time period.
But I really appreciate you having invited me. And I hope that people have enjoyed listening.
Yeah, I hope so too. Thanks so much.
And they'll, follow along on, on Instagram. See what we're all eating in April to June next year, and and maybe consider adding something wild to their diet, even if it's just a few nettles or something. If you are what you eat and you add something wild, what does that make you?
Ooh, I love it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding Podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guest and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. If you're new to rewilding and want to expand your perception of it, I recommend attending one of my Rewilding 101 workshops, which I offer both in person in Portland, Oregon, and online for those who live around the world via Zoom. You can check upcoming dates and register at rewildportland.com. Thank you for listening.